Hello, my name is Kelsey Eschbach. I'm from Pennsylvania. I will be graduating from Ball State next May, this coming up May. And I currently work two jobs as an autistic support paraprofessional in a middle school, and I also do home hours with a client for 3 days a week.
All right, and I am Emma Kidwell. I live in Indianapolis, and I work as an RBT in a clinic-based setting. I plan to graduate not this next May, but the May after.
Okay, I am Reagan Roberts. I live in Indianapolis, Indiana as well, and I also work as an RBT at an early intervention clinic here in Indy.
And my name is Kristen Rooney. I live in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and I work as a special ed teacher, and I work with kids who have autism and other mental health disorders.
Hi, I am Carrie Shang, and I am from Indianapolis, Indiana also. I am a stay-at-home mom, and I'm hoping to graduate in the spring of 2019. In this presentation, we are going to discuss a study we chose to replicate by Eck, Miltenberger, and Valbuena, 2016. A study titled Promoting Physical Activity Among School-Aged Children Using Feedback, Goal Setting, and Rewards, evaluating goal setting and rewards to increase the daily steps in children. Before I go into detail regarding the study, I'm going to give some background information on why there is a need to increase physical activity among children. Tudor-Lock et al. Evaluated daily steps taken by obese and normal weight 6 to 12-year-old boys and girls and concluded that boys need 15,000 steps and girls need 12,000 steps each day to maintain a healthy weight. According to the CDC, Center for Disease Control, maintaining normal weight is important because obesity is associated with several potentially severe health risks. Obesity is defined by BMI, body mass index. BMI is defined by a person's weight in kilograms divided by the square height in meters. Some of the consequences of high BMI include obesity, hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, increased risk of osteoporosis, increased risk of colon and breast cancer, high risk for depression and anxiety. Also, inactivity has the potential to decrease a person's life expectancy. The estimated annual medical cost of obesity in the United States was $147 billion in 2008, and the medical costs for people who have obesity were $1,429 higher than those of normal weight. More than 1/3, 36.5% of all Americans have obesity. As I already discussed, increasing aerobic activity by taking more steps throughout the day has shown to potentially decrease BMI, which could reduce the prevalence of obesity. Aerobic activity can be defined as any movement of the participant's body, such as walking, running, and jumping, that increases the number of steps the participant takes each day. A step can be defined as picking up and placing the foot back down on the ground while advancing the body in a forward or backward motion. Eck et al. Study evaluated feedback, goal setting, and rewards administered by parents to promote physical activity among 5 children ages 8 to 11 years old with a BMI higher than 23. Children with a BMI of more than 23 is considered obese according to the CDC. During baseline, participants wore sealed pedometers. The intervention consisted of goal setting and rewards delivered by parents for meeting daily goals. A step goal was determined for each day, and rewards were delivered contingent upon reaching the goal. Parents and children chose specific reinforcers that the parents could provide daily at no cost, such as toys, computer, and iPod, touch time, and activities. By using individualized available reinforcers administered by the parents, the behavior change may be more likely to be generalized and be maintained after the study is complete. All participants met their goals and 3 children increased their daily steps. 3 children who received a second intervention, consisting of the addition of a daily text or phone call from the researcher to check progress towards the goal, increased their steps further. 2 children participated in maintenance, and both maintained their increased steps. During all phases, pedometer data was collected in all settings throughout the day. Goal setting, contract preparation, pedometer checks, and delivery of rewards occurred in the home. The results of the Eck et al. 2016 study indicated that an intervention for increasing children's exercise habits, in which parents were required to deliver rewards to their children for reaching a specific step count, can be somewhat effective. The purpose of this study is to show that an increase in aerobic activity, walking and running, is obtainable by replicating the study Eck et al. 2016 with adult female graduate students. Goal setting and positive reinforcement was utilized to effectively increase participant steps. In this replication study, Emma used a Fitbit charged to tracking device. Kelsey and Reagan used a Series 1 Apple Watch. Kristen and myself used an iPhone tracking app. Google Docs were used to document daily steps and data, as well as to compose graphs to visually display trends in daily steps.
So for our data collection system, data was collected using iPhone tracking devices, Apple Watches, and Fitbits. Tracking devices were worn on the participant's wrist if it was a watch or a Fitbit, or it stayed in the participant's pocket since it was on an iPhone app. This counted their steps based on their movement. Used to input each participant's daily steps, and graphs were generated from those tables that were in the Google Doc. Participant used a secondary tracking device, like a pedometer or a second iPhone app, etc., to serve as a secondary observer. Discrepancy between the 2 devices, the average of the 2 readings was used, and then the device will then be recalibrated. In this study, each participant set a goal to achieve every day to receive reinforcement. For our study replication, the goal is determined by taking the average of baseline steps and then rounding it to the nearest 1,000. An example, I had 10 days in baseline, so the total steps in baseline was 71,413. The number of days, which is 10, which gave me a little over 7,000, down to 7,000 steps per day.
During baseline, all 5 participants tracked their steps on their chosen devices. The steps were tracked from the time the participant got out of bed in the morning to the time they got into bed at night. The dates of baseline vary from to each participant. Some participants chose to implement a shorter baseline, so 5 days. A couple participants chose to extend their baseline to 10 days, and this was just solely based on the variability of their data. Like we mentioned earlier, how baseline was taken was through a step tracking device, and the devices ranged from things such as an iPhone app, Apple Watches, and Fitbits. So our baseline phase looks as follows. There were 4 steps. The first step was just to make sure that your tracking device was set to 0 when the participant got out of bed. Each participant had to wear the step tracking device throughout the entire day until they got into bed. During baseline, the participants were not allowed to look at the amount of steps taken during the day, because this would then, it could motivate them or give us, false data because they, wanted to increase their steps. So we were not allowed to look at it during baseline. And then step 4, at the end of each day, the steps were just recorded in a table in a group Google Doc. During our intervention phase, we took the average of our baseline, like Emma said, rounded it to the nearest 1,000, and then this would constitute our criterion goal. All participants wore their step tracking devices all day, every day. If their step goal was reached during intervention, the participant received their chosen reinforcer the following day. Before implementing our intervention phase, a behavior contract was created and signed and dated by each participant. As you can see, the behavior contract is as follows. Reinforcement was chosen. Each participant selected their own reinforcement. Like I said earlier, if the step goal was met that day, reinforcement was delivered the following day.
Inter-observer agreement, or IOA. Based on the nature of the study, each subject was the primary observer and there was no third-party observer. Instead, once per week, each participant used a secondary tracking device to serve as the secondary observer. For example, if a Fitbit was being used as the primary tracking device, once per week, an iPhone app was used in addition to Fitbit in order to have a secondary tracking device for IOA. This also served the purpose to ensure accuracy for the devices. If there was ever an irregularity or discrepancy between the 2 devices, an average of the 2 readings would be used. The following slides are IOA data that was collected. Using Kelsey's table as a model, you can see that IOA data was recorded 1 time per week. We then calculated the smaller count divided by the larger count and multiplied that number by 100 to get the IOA percentage. Kelsey's data showed an IOA percentage of 100%, as did Emma's, myself, Reagan, and Carrie's. Treatment fidelity. Treatment fidelity is defined as the strategies that monitor and enhance the accuracy and consistency of an intervention to ensure it is implemented as planned and that each component is delivered in a comparable manner to all study participants over time. Treatment fidelity for our study. In the beginning, to find the accuracy of our devices, we manually counted the set of steps, either 10 or 15 steps, and then checked the devices for accuracy. After that check, we deemed the devices accurate for the start of intervention. Treatment fidelity was achieved through periodic checks of accuracy of pedometers, and the periodic testing of pedometers led to a high probability of data collection. Documenting steps daily through our Google Docs, and having checking provides everyone the opportunity to keep each other accountable.
So as you can see in this table, this is just showing my raw data for the entire study. I was in baseline for 5 days with a pretty stable baseline, so I then went to intervention for the rest of my study. This table is just a nice overview of some important numbers that we analyzed at the end of our study. The average of my steps from baseline to intervention had an increase of 10.10%. I then graphed my data baseline shows that I had more data points above my criterion line than below, indicating a pretty successful implementation. So I measured my baseline data for 5 days. I then decided I would start my intervention phase. Due to considering the behavior being measured, I considered that I had a fairly stable baseline. I did have a large range in the intervention phase, but that could be attributed to a variety of factors, which we will discuss in the limitation section of our presentation. I did have a positive increase of my average number of steps from baseline to intervention. So to me, this proves that my intervention was successful.
So this is a table of my raw data. So I also stayed in baseline for 5 days and then continued my intervention for 40 days. Here you can see that on the 3rd day it was a pretty high number, but other than that it was fairly stable in my baseline. And then this is a table that shows my average steps in baseline as well as my average steps in intervention. And you can see that I increased by 41%. And this is my graph from my baseline and my intervention. So I have the criterion line at my goal, which was set at 5,500. You can see that I was significantly above my goal for most of the intervention phase. I began my study by taking baseline of my number of steps per day for a total of 5 days. And after graphing my data, I determined that although 1 day of steps was much greater than that, overall it was stable enough to begin the intervention process. When beginning the intervention phase, I thought that I was expecting to be right at or only slightly higher than my daily step goal. But as you could see that I was much higher at 41% increase. And there are a few reasons for this, for the fluctuation. Several days I spent hiking when I was on vacation, so I was walking much more than average, which could have skewed with my results. But overall, the percent increase from my baseline to intervention phase proves that the intervention was effective.
Here is just a sample of my raw data. I stayed in baseline for 10 days because I wasn't confident enough in my first 5 days being stable enough. And then I moved on to the intervention phase. Here you can see that my baseline average was a little over 7,000, and then my intervention average was a little over 9,500, and that and here my graph, you can see the criterion line at 7,000, which was my initial goal, and most of my data points are above that criterion line. So after taking baseline for 5 days and graphing the data, I wasn't sure if it was stable enough to move on. If you saw the graph, there were a couple of like really radically different points, and that is just from one day I had surgery and the other day I hiked a lot. So that would be the reasoning for those weird points. So the study was to increase the physical activity and overall amount of steps taken per day. I found the study to be successful because when I look at the numbers, my daily steps increased from each phase. The total average number of steps increased from baseline, and my goal was met more times than not. At the graph, there is a slight increase in trend, so I would deem that my part of the study is a success for increasing my physical activity.
And this is a look at my raw data. As you can see, I had 10 days in baseline, and then I moved into phase 1. And after 13 days in phase 1, I wasn't confident with the increase. So I moved into phase 2, which is an additional amount of prompts. Next on my table, you'll see that my baseline was 7,007.4. And then during my intervention 1 or my phase 1, my increase was 3.32%. So when I moved into 2, I ended up having a negative increase, and my average went down to 6,641.31. My total average was 6,904, so my goal of 7,000 was not met. And this is a look at my graph, and if you notice the criterion line, you'll notice there are more points below the criterion line than there are above it. So after 5 days of reporting my baseline data, I graphed it and determined that my baseline was not stable. And so I decided to extend baseline for 5 more days. And after 10 days, I determined that baseline was stable and I was ready for phase 1 of the intervention. During that time, there were some limitations. My work schedule led me to be more stationary, which caused a decrease in my steps. And that with other responsibilities, I was not confident with my increase of steps, so I moved to phase 2 for additional prompts. During phase 2, my data showed an even more of a fluctuation than expected. That was due to other limitations such as traveling and other work constraints, and it led to a decrease in my baseline data. Overall, it showed that there was negative 0.47 increase, so there was a decrease in my data, and the goal was not met. Based on my results, I would have to say that there is not a functional relationship between providing feedback, rewards, goal setting, or prompts. My data was inconclusive on how the combinations could increase steps per day, and that because there was either increase or decrease in my daily steps, there cannot be a functional relationship. After calculating my overall average of steps per day, and I saw the decrease in my baseline data, it demonstrated a negative increase. And it meant that my goal was not met, nor did my steps increase. Therefore, the intervention for me was not successful.
This is my raw data, and as you can see, there are some fluctuations in baseline. However, there was enough stability that I started the intervention phase. My goal was 9,000 steps, and my percentage increase was negative 8.78%, meaning that there was actually a decrease of 8.78% from my 9,000 steps per day, my initial goal. My graph is showing some stability in baseline and a lot of fluctuations in the intervention phase. After taking baseline data for 5 consecutive days, I found my baseline data to be fairly stable. After graphing my baseline data, I determined that my data was stable enough to begin the intervention phase, even with a decrease in steps on day 4. My intervention goal was based on my baseline average. When starting the intervention phase, my steps were above my baseline average. However, with the demands of being a parent to 2 very active little ones and being a competitive mid-distance runner with mileage days that can definitely vary, my steps fluctuated throughout the replication study. Throughout the 49 days of collecting data, there were also some inconsistencies in steps due to my son, who was very ill throughout the semester, causing decrease in steps due to time at the hospital, doctor's visits, and appointments. On days that my steps significantly were increased was due to having a high mileage training day, or where my children were well and very active. On days where my daily steps were decreased, or under my baseline average, my son was ill and had a lot of downtime. Overall, my data had a negative 8.78% decrease, demonstrating that my overall goal of 9,000 steps was not met. Based on my results, there is not a functional relationship between providing feedback, rewards, and goal setting, and the intervention for me was not successful.
So this table is of our results, and it outlines each individual's average baseline steps, their goal for intervention, as well as their average intervention steps, depicting if their goal was met. It also describes each participant's percentage of IOA based upon the second tracking device used, as described before in the presentation. Some limitations that we ran into when replicating the study were time constraints. So several participants experienced scheduling conflicts that disallowed for accurate step tracking, such as vacations and work and home conflicts, where the device was not used or was inaccurate. Another limitation was the number of participants. We feel if we had more individuals participating in the study, the overall results may have been different and given us a better understanding of a functional relationship between the feedback, goal setting, and rewards and average daily steps. The technology that we used was also not perfect. So actually all of us used a device such as an Apple Watch, a Fitbit, or an iPhone, and all of these require a significant battery charge to operate for a full day. Lastly, we use self-reinforcement rather than having a third party. So feedback and social praise was provided by our group members. However, the person delivering the reinforcement for meeting our daily goal was ourselves. In the original study, the participants' parents delivered the reinforcer, and this third party delivering may have led to success. So in conclusion, the intervention of goal setting and rewards increased the average number of steps taken per day for 3 out of 5 participants. Only one of the participants completed a phase 2 of the intervention process, where they added prompting along with their reward to increase their daily steps. However, due to several of the limitations discussed, phase 2 was unsuccessful. Due to all the inconsistencies between the participants' data, it's not safe to say that a functional relationship exists between the intervention and the participants' daily steps. So future studies that resemble this one or that replicate this original study should consider using a real walking pedometer versus a device that has the same capability, ensuring that reinforcement is delivered by a third party, and including more participants. And then here is a list of several of the references we used when completing our study.
Great. That was our study. Thanks for watching.